before we get started, before we get in our prayer, we have a lot of prayer requests on the folder out front. If you, I just want to read through some of the names and then we'll say our prayer. And I don't want to forget any of these folks, though, before we get started, have them in our thoughts and our Erica Butler, Brandon Forshaw, Jim Weaver, Miss Sue Camrat, Marie Scott, Dennis Nolan's mother, Brian Nolan, Harold Collins, Elaine Earhart, Jack Clark, Nate Forbes, Jim Putterball, Davey Addy, and then the sick, shut-ins, and the widows and the widowers. So we're a pretty big group of worshipers, so that maybe is not as big a list as it looks like on a piece of paper, but it looked like a pretty big list, and I wanted to make sure we didn't miss anybody before we got praying. So if y'all will, let's start in prayer. Father, we are so thankful to be here this Sunday morning in all your glory. We ask that you would watch over us and help us with this lesson today to learn from your story of David and Goliath. We are thankful that we have this history recorded for us, that we can come back thousands of years later and talk about it in great detail. We're also thankful, Father, for your Son and the New Testament and the promise of things that are new. And we're just so thankful that we have you to look to guide us. And we hope that you will help us in our day, that we walk like your Son, and that we talk like him, we act like him, and we do everything in our power to share his love and compassion and grace with those that we run into throughout it this week. We ask that you watch over us, and I'm sure there are many more that are sick and not able to make it that weren't mentioned earlier, but we ask that you watch over our flock, keep us healthy and keep us safe, and protect us from those things that are going on in this world that we don't have a lot of control over. Some we don't quite understand all the things that are going on, but if we can just keep our faith in you and our eye on the prize, which is heaven, we know, Father, that in the end time for us, that we will be rewarded with a life of eternity with you and Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen. Okay, so I'm going to start off just going back to my last couple of weeks. So we have a company trip every year. If you perform to a certain extent, you get to go on a company trip and you get to take your spouse. So this year we got to go to Montana, and I had never been to Montana. I don't get out much. For those of you guys that know me, I stay pretty close. If it's not on a beach or on a boat or somewhere within about 3 hours, I'm not typically going. So for me, it was a really big trip. We had a blast. We went to Yellowstone. We did everything. Well, on the way back, we had the fortune of having a 5-hour layover in Denver. And that Monday afternoon, about 3 o'clock, I had to leave work, wasn't feeling well. And I'd never had COVID before, but 3 weeks ago, I got COVID. And I'm going to blame it on the Denver airport. And it wasn't just that, it was that everybody in my family, I gave it to everybody in my family. Because Sunday after church, we had a little celebration and yada, yada, yada. We hadn't seen them in a while. So I feel great. Just can't breathe. So when I got mince my mouth, and if I get to talking and you can't hear me, somebody just step in and take over. You guys are all very well versed at what we're going to talk about today, but that's my first bout with that stuff, and it just wasn't a lot of fun. I would highly not recommend it. But anyway, today we're going to talk about David and Goliath, and not being a children's story. And I think about some of our most famous children's stories: David and Goliath, Jonah and the whale, and Daniel. We can go through tons of stuff. As a matter of fact, I think we have a whole list of Sunday lessons that we're talking about that are stories that we learned typically as a child. So I'll start off by asking you guys, so when was the first time that you heard the story of David and Goliath? Was it when you read it yourself, or was it in a Bible class? Was it grandma or grandpa? Anybody want to volunteer when they first heard David and Goliath? Right before you can read. Amen. Yep, early. You get David and Goliath early. So why do you think David and Goliath is one of those stories that you got hit with real early in life? Yep. 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 Yeah, it really is kind of the perfect kids, story, right, to start off with. Jonah and the whale is a really cool story. Jonah was a hardhead. I mean, he was just a hardhead, and he had all kinds of opportunities to not end up where he ended up. David was not that, right? It's a really good story to start off with, the young. And I think I was, I don't know when I first heard it. When I first remember it from Bible class. We were in the Floral City Church of Christ. There was probably 20 people in that church at that time. And our Bible classes were, you went out back and kind of in a basement, and there was the Bible classes there. And they had the rooms all set up, with the big pictures of David and big pictures of Goliath, little pictures of David, and some other little, scenes about what it may have looked like. Here's some rocks, and here's a sling, and that kind of stuff. Those visualizations, kind of help those stories sink in your mind. I think we've had some VBS here in this building that had to do with David and Goliath. It's a very impactful, powerful story, all truth. And there's a lot to 1 Samuel 17, which we're actually going to read today. But it is it's easy to talk with kids about. They typically love it, and it's a really cool thing that this kid, which really was just a young man, overpowered this big, huge giant, and that everybody else was, scared to do what he did. So it's whether you heard it from your grandparents or from church, or it's probably one that you heard early and that stuck with you for years. With many of our favorite children's stories, later on in life, to teach them as an adult class, you have to overcome some things, right? We don't teach a lot of lessons on David and Goliath from a preaching perspective, and I know Jody has before. I know he's done Jonah before, but you always kind of have to overcome when you're teaching off of stories that are this famous. You kind of have to overcome, the children's version of what you heard. And one of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to read. So I want to go to 1 Samuel 17, and we're going to read that, and we're going to kind of go along the way and talk about it, and see if we got what kind of comments we have. Yeah. Okay. Well, we may or may not go forward today, but I think I got it memorized. We'll be all right. So I'm going to start off in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Azekah and Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up the battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." So that's about 9 feet, right? A little more than 9 feet. So that's a pretty big boy. How much do you imagine David was about that time? About how tall? Maybe even 5 feet would probably be, maybe a little more than 5 feet. He was young. Jews are not, known to be extremely tall back in the day. This Goliath was a giant, so he was little. He was a little bitty. So he was, about 9 feet, and he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And I read that's about 125 pounds. So that's a big old coat. He had a bronze armor on his legs and bronze javelin between his shoulders. The shaft of a spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. That 600 shekels is about 15 pounds. Some people lift through the dumbbells with about 15 pounds. This guy was throwing a spear that had a head on the end of it, about 15 pounds. So just to start there for a second, we know factually, scripturally, that there were giants back in those days, and we know that they were big folks and they were strong and they ruled. There is a difference between strength of people that are big versus people that are not. I'll give you an example. When I was a kid growing up, I grew up on a farm, again in Floral City. My dad was 6'9", he weighed 265 pounds, and at 65 years old, he could still take me in the dirt in 2 seconds. It would not take him 2 seconds to put me down. My sister was 10 years older than me, still is 10 years older than me. Yeah, thank goodness. When her boyfriends would come over to take him out, and I think back in those days it was the Beatles and the Stones and all that kind of good stuff. They had to come shake Big John's hand, and they had to kind of pass that rite of passage. He was just a big man. I mean, there was not one kid, didn't matter if he was a star football player or whatever it was, that he would not put on the ground just with a handshake. And it's not just that he was big, that helps, but when you are a farmer and you use those muscles and that strength every single day of your life, and you're fighting cows and you're fighting pigs and you're fighting everything else, farm equipment, you use stuff that you don't use, like when you're 25 years old and you've been working in a restaurant now for 5 years, and you may think you have the world by the tail, but your dad can still lay you out like a little kid. So I say all that to say, Goliath was a big old boy, but he was strong. He was strong. He could probably snap David like a twig in about 2 seconds. If you've ever carried around 15 pounds for more than 5 or 10 minutes, this guy was throwing those things. So he was a big guy, and it was something for the Israelites in general to have to see across that valley into that other hillside. That's what they had to look at every day, right? So then he stood and he cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man of yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And verse 11 says, "When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." So I can understand that. I get that, right? There are things that I run into in life that I don't really want to deal with. I might have a little fear, and it's not somebody coming at me that's a few hundred pounds and 9 foot tall. So the challenge was laid out. Their first reaction was to be afraid. That was it. The first thing out of their first thought was to be afraid. And then in verse 12 starts talking about David. It says, "David was the son of that Ephraite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of the 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him, Abinadab, and the third, Shammah." Verse 14 says, "David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul." So I think, if I remember correctly, you had to be 20 to be able to be in the army at that time. So let's say that the youngest was at 20, so we know David was a lot younger than that. So, but the 3 oldest sons, they were in the army. They were seeing the Philistines every day across the mountain. They were there with the army. So David had not had that exposure yet, fixing to, but they were there every day. Verse 15 says, "David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep of Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening." So we're on one mountain, there's a valley, we're on another mountain, and for 40 days, this big old guy comes out and just ridicules them and embarrasses them and bullies them and picks at them, and for 40 days they don't do anything. In verse 17 it says, "Then Jesse said to his son David, 'Take now for your brothers an ephah of the dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. 19, now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David rose up early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. In verse 22 it says, David left his supplies to the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked to them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw this man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So for 40 days, they get this same speech. David comes in, he hears the speech, everybody takes off because they're all afraid. I imagine they go back to their tents or their caves or whatever they have to do to not acknowledge that they just heard the threats of this one guy that's challenging the army here. Verse 25 it says, so the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. And then 26 says, then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproaches from Israel? For what is the uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And there's where we get started, right? So if you go back to the beginning, and you got Goliath coming out, threatening these guys every morning and every evening. All they have is fear in their hearts. All they can think of is, I'm not going into that mess, right? It's not going to be me. I'm not going to be the one. You got this kid that comes along. He hears it. He asks what the reward's going to be. And then the first thing he says is, for who is the uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the army of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. So they tell him what's going to happen to the person that kills him, but again, none of them volunteer to go down there. And then 28, Eliab, the oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and innocence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as if the first ones did. So again, he's not getting any brave guys coming out and standing up to take on this challenge. David's pointing out that we're an army of God, and it doesn't seem to really be impacting them that well. So 31, now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fall because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him. You are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb out of the flocks, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. So there he goes again. Now he's got to convince the king that it's not, this is not a big deal for him. First of all, since I was a youth, I've been killing bears and lions, protecting the sheep. If I can handle them, I can handle this. Oh, by the way, don't forget, we are an army of the living God. And then verse 37, moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the fawn, from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Well, that's great, right? Thank you for all your help, your support. Thanks for any words of wisdom. Just go and, little man, and do what you got to do. So, in 38, Saul clothed David with his armor, put a bronze helmet on his head, also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to the armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag and in a pouch which he had had. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So he took his armor. It was probably too big for him. It wasn't something that he was used to. So he said, I'm going like I'm going. I'm going to pick up my bag and my rocks, and I'm headed down. In 41, the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, and he said he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. I don't know why they have to put in good-looking. Why do you think they put in good-looking? That's David's always been known as good-looking because of this right here. He's a good-looking dude, right? Anyway, he was so good-looking, even Goliath said he was good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog? You come down at me with sticks. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you with the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. So now he's throwing God up in his face. He's going to let him know who's going to win this battle right here. I don't think it affects Goliath a whole lot, but he's going to let him know what's coming down. And in 46 says, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give you the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines, the birds of the air, and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. So that's a pretty powerful statement. I mean, if you just stop there for a second and you think about this transaction from David bringing down the bread and the cheese, he sees his brothers, hey, little kid, don't really acknowledge him a whole lot. He hears the giant ridiculing, mocking the Israelites. He challenges some of them to, we are children of the living God. Doesn't affect anybody. He goes to Saul, says the same thing. Doesn't really affect Saul, but after some convincing, he decided to let him go fight. But when he gets to this giant, he doesn't, cow to the giant. He puts God right up in his face and says, this is how it's going to be. You're fixing to learn about the power of my God. And, of course, Goliath, I'm sure, thought that was a joke. You got a 9-foot dude and this 5-foot something. But David knew what was behind him and knew what was with him. And he wasn't fighting Goliath alone. He was fighting Goliath for God. So, in verse 47, it says, then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hands of David. So therefore, David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his own sword, drew it out of the sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head and with it. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they ran. Well, so the fear immediately turns just with one swift rock and a sword that cuts off this guy's head. So now the battles of tide have changed, and now everybody from Israel wants to fight. We're going to fight. So in verse 52 it says, now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim, and even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they had plundered their tents. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his armor in his tent. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? Now, how is that possible? How can we go through this whole story and all this that David did with him, and he still doesn't even know who David is? How is that possible? I think, Saul maybe had a little memory lapse, but he says here, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. So Abner acted like he doesn't know. So in 56, so the king inquires with who this young man is, and then David returned with the slaughter of the Philistine. Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse. And that's how that story ends. So there's a lot of adult stuff in there. I look back at the children's story and certainly can see the impact of that story, right? I mean, for a kid, that is just an unbelievable story that sticks with you forever. And oh, by the way, it's not the first time you hear it, it's never just the last time you hear it, right? I mean, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You get a little more understanding of what that all meant, and what did a 15-pound spear really look like? What does a 9-foot guy really look like? What does a 125-pound male coat look like? I mean, so that story grows and grows and grows. But there is a story bigger in all this that maybe kids don't really get. Actually, kids they do get it, probably more than we do, right? We probably unlearn it, have to come back and learn it. They get it in their hearts early because we tell them. They trust us. They read more, they get reinforced more. And to them, why wasn't David ever going to win? Of course he was going to win. He was God's soldier. God had David. So they kind of, I think they kind of get that a little easier than we get. As we get older, we need more convincing. What are some of the lessons that pop up in your mind reading this whole story that we can take with us in our daily battle that comes from David and Goliath? Anybody dealing with any giants? Yes, sir? Absolutely. Yep. Yep. They're just paralyzed. I thought that same thing, Matt. It's it can be at work, right? That can happen at work, right? You can know that you're supposed to do the right thing. You can be around someone that you know is not doing the right thing, and because you don't want to rock the boat any, you just kind of let it go. So it can be a work thing. It can be a family thing. Oh boy, let's don't get started with our family. We know that this happened, and we don't want to just not talk about it. Let's talk about it. Or do we just say, I don't want to go there. I don't want drama. I don't want to start a conflict. Da 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 da. Yes, sir.
What got me about that part of it was that Goliath came out at the set time of day. It was day after day, same time of the day. And when I was much younger, I thought, that's like the 12 o'clock and 5 o'clock news.
Yeah. Yeah.
This guy was delivering the 12
He
o'clock
was.
and 5 o'clock news.
Yeah.
And they knew he would come out.
Yep.
And but they kept going out. They were mesmerized. They were hypnotized.
Sure.
And they had to listen.
Absolutely.
Every time they listened, it just reinforced that fear that they had, that paralyzed.
That's a good point.
Sometimes maybe they should have turned off the TV.
I was just going to say, and if you turn that back to us, maybe there's some,
Going out there listening.
yeah,
David had not been listening.
maybe there are some times we shouldn't be paying as much attention to Facebook or Instagram or the 5 o'clock news. I mean, that's a plethora of information that we get at 8 o'clock or 12 o'clock or 5 o'clock every single day in our lives. Mr. Conley, were you raised here? Oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
I think you can analogy to that versus what happens in society today. My mentor taught me that true faith in God will not allow you to stay on the good country, but I think something to get out. Sometimes you have to pick up the rock.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the church needs to be in the right to pick up the rock and move and get the faith.
Sure. All right. Why do you think that that does not happen as often as it should? Yeah. 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 So it brings up another conversation, which is, and we're off slide now, and we're just going to keep going. So when I was a kid, I was in the Church of Christ till I was probably 8 or 9. Family went through a bad divorce, and it was ugly. And the church was involved. They came out to the house, and we had visits, and so over years, for some reason, it seemed to me like the church got a really bad reputation as being like the only ones ever going to heaven, and we're not a very inclusive group. We're more exclusive, and I think whether that's true or not, because again, I was pretty young back in those days, but it seems like there are times when we try to overcome and being more inclusive and not maybe hurting people with certain things that we maybe even have a question about. It's a rough thing. Politics is we could go around this room and there's going to be Republicans, there's going to be Democrats, there's going to be independents, and there's going to be, I ain't voting for none of them. There's going to be all that right here in this group. So it's hard to manage that flock. Elder, yes, sir. Yeah. Right. Yep. 5. 1. One rock. Yeah. He probably just wasn't sure if there were going to be 4 more people coming out of that tent, just in case. He had to be loaded for bear and lion, just in case. But no, that's a great point. That's a great point. Yes, ma'am. Right. There you go. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Good point. Good point. That's his, definitely was his weapon of choice for a reason, right? Yes, sir? Mm-hmm. Yep. Great. Mm-hmm. All right. Sure. Yep. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. Very well said. So, how do we get a warrior mind? So, David obviously had a warrior mind. So, he fought other things. He didn't fight people. He fought bears and lions, and he protected sheep. But he practiced it, and he practiced a ton. Um, he wasn't really a trained army professional, but he had more of a warrior mind than the folks that were, right? So how do we get that warrior mind in our daily lives, fight the battles that we fight, the Goliaths that we have? How do we get that in our daily activities, our daily mind, our daily battle? Yep, right. So how did David know God's word back in those days? Probably. And how did he learn it back in those days? Yeah, right. So family. Yep, you heard it. He wasn't out there with scrolls and going, keeping sheep and all that. I mean, it was something word of mouth that was passed down that he had, and he had it in his heart, and he knew that these things were true. This was the history of his nation. So, how do we do that? And we got a little easier today, right? I mean, we got a Bible, and we have these examples. Scheduling is a little different. He didn't have Zoom and teledocs and all those kind of things. Yes, sir.
I thought about that with Joseph.
Yep.
How did they know? Because they were young men.
They were young.
And they had to be. They heard the stories of crossing the Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
They heard the stories of the walls of Jerusalem. Maybe they even sang that song.
Mm-hmm.
They sang the songs. They heard the stories crossing Egypt, coming out of Egypt. They heard the stories about Moses. And I thought about Joseph specifically. His father knew dreams from God.
Mm-hmm.
His father before him, his father before him. They had dreams from God. They knew. And they would have told the stories. So some dismissed it, and some took it to heart.
Sure.
Kind of like a kid that listens to a story and says, "Oh, I want to be that guy." guy. I want to be that guy. And David was that boy that wanted to be that guy.
He was after God's heart, right?
Yeah.
So,
He had that faith based on what he heard.
Yeah.
Faith comes by hearing.
and I think that's a good example of us today. So a lot of us have either kids or grandkids that are in this class, and they're not either one the same, right? I have 2 kids. They are not even remotely close to the same. Shelby was this way and into different types of athletics and yada yada yada, and Jordan was this way, and he liked basketball, but he was more into hunting and fishing and outside stuff. But their friends were very different types of friends, and we had different battles, and it was we have a Bible today, but we get kind of distracted real easily from telling the story of this to our kids and their grandkids and their friends that come over. Do they see us pray before we eat? I mean, all those kind of things. There's a lot of this, and if you have little kids, they're not doing this yet, but they're going to be doing this at some point, right? The TV sometimes takes over. We have different things that go after our faith. I think one of the things that we have to do is remember that while we have this book, back in the days, they orated. They had their family, and they had the trust of their father or their mother or their grandmother or their favorite aunt, whatever it was, talking to them about God and talking to them about their faith and how they came to know Jesus. And today it's easy for us to get pulled away from that, and sometimes we count on the church to do some of that, right? Sometimes we count on the church to do a good job for us with the Bible classes, which I know they do. But what happens after that on Sunday? I mean, yes, sir. Correct. They took off. They took off, and they chased them all the way back to Gath. They ran for a long way, so it shook them up pretty good. We're just a few minutes out. Any more thoughts before I kind of wrap this up? Yes, sir, Drew? Mm-hmm. Sure. Great points. My strength with Chandler and with Palmer will not be singing to Chandler and Palmer, right? So I'm going to have to tell stories, and I'll let Angie do the singing. So I'm going to leave with just a couple of quick thoughts. The Israelites, the army, they were focused on the fear, right? The fear got to them, and they could not shake the fear. It came out there 40 days, twice a day. They couldn't shake it. David never focused on the fear. Fear never came up. It was never part of his vocabulary. It wasn't in his thought process. He focused on his faith in God, and he was never shaken. And then the last thing is how great is God in your life? And when you have giants in your life that you have to overcome, how quick are you to run to them and take care of them, or how quick are you to hide away from them and not meet them head on? You have brothers and sisters that can help you with that. We don't have to do it by ourselves, but we do have to fight the battle, right? The battle's going to come to us. It says all the way through this Bible that the battle's going to come to us. We have to be prepared. It's not going to be a cakewalk. We're going to be tempted. We're going to have losses in our life. We're going to have illness. We're going to have sin, all that. But what do we do when it comes to us? Do we run away from it, or act in fear, or do we get help? Do we run at it head on? So he definitely ran at it head on. So thank you guys for helping. Thank you for adding there. I appreciate it. And have a good Sunday.